I'm going to be talking to you about the Victorian widow, who I want to introduce to you. And this fits into a wider study that I'm currently doing and hoping to be transforming into a book, which is the widow in British literature and culture right from the mid-19th century through to probably around about the mid-20th century, depending on when I run out of energy and material. So you may wonder why then, if it's such a big project, I introduce you to the Victorian widow. Well, the Victorian widow is a really, really singular figure at the time, and what I hope you can see as I talk you through why she's such a singular and specific and very interesting figure is that also I think the aspects that we find of the figure of the widow in British literature and culture during the 19th century very much informs how she's represented and what role she plays in culture and society in the 20th century. So I thought it would be a good start to introduce you to the Victorian widow, and I'll try and throw in a few bits here and there about how she may have changed in the 20th century. But really, to get you started, you might wonder why there's a picture of a man if I'm talking to you about widows. This is Mr. Weller from Dickens' The Pickwick Papers. And Mr. Weller is there because he has a very particular opinion of widows, because he says that widows are exceptions to every rule. And that is exactly the perfect sentence to introduce the Victorian widow to you, and it's exactly the reason why she was so exceptional. And I want to talk to you about why she was so exceptional by looking at three areas in particular. One is her financial and legal status. The other, we'll come to that later, the other is her sexual and social status, and then finally I want to take a little bit of a closer look at mourning clothes in particular and why they were so significant for the Victorians and for the widow in particular. So first off, the widow's financial and legal status in the 19th century was significant because, as you can see here from this pamphlet, from the suffragette pamphlet, which is actually from the early 20th century, widows could be left financially absolutely destitute. They would rely, if they were poor or if they were from the lower middle classes and couldn't afford life assurance, which was only just coming into being in the 1860s. So the insurance system as we know it now didn't exist. She could be left absolutely destitute with no money whatsoever, absolutely reliant on finding employment for herself, obviously at the same time potentially looking after a family, being reliant on the charity of the state. Of course, we didn't have a welfare state yet, so on the charity of the church very often. And what you can see on this particular pamphlet is that the widow asks, can nothing alter my husband's will? And the law says, no, madam, a man may leave his money to whom he likes, but you must maintain your children. That is one of the laws of England. So basically what they're alluding to here is that at the time, even up to the early 20th century, a man had no obligation to provide for his widow after his death. He could leave all his money to his mistress if he wanted. There was absolutely no law against that. But the law said that the woman at this point in time had to maintain her children, and you can see the obvious contradiction in that. But of course, not every widow was necessarily poor. You also had very well-off or indeed aristocratic or rich widows. And they are particularly interesting to me here, because what that means, remember in the mid-19th century, property laws for women were only just developing. They were developing constantly, and women were able to own more and more property legally, but it was very much a developmental state at the time. So what's interesting about the widow is that she's an exception here, because once her husband is dead, she was actually able to own her own property and to be the guardian of that property, to be responsible for it. So in that sense already, she was very different from other women. She was different from spinsters, for example, whom we'll come to later, because they were also much less regarded in society and much more condemned. So there is this financial aspect of the widow, which either could render her a case of charity, or which could make her actually a very powerful woman, who obviously was also free to remarry. And if she was rich, then she had all the more the choice and could be quite threatening, as it were. And in many fictional accounts, for example, you will read of people thinking very carefully about inviting a rich widow to their dinner party if they want to marry off their own daughters first, because of course a rich, sexually experienced widow may be seen as more attractive in that case. And this leads nicely and interlinks quite clearly with her social and sexual status. Because of mourning clothes, but also because of the customs of the time and also the religious customs. You can see here, let me introduce you to Mrs. Howson. This is Mrs. Howson in deep mourning in the 1860s, approximately 1860s, 1870s. And what you can see here is that, quite literally, but also figuratively, once a wife's husband died, she almost became a kind of monument, a reminder of his life. And that also means, in this case, we have no idea what she looks like, Mrs. Howson. It also means, in this case, almost losing her identity. Remember, for the Victorians in Britain, certainly for the middle classes, once you were a wife as a woman and a mother, that was your identity. That was the pinnacle of what you were supposed to achieve. And so, once your husband dies, you almost lose your identity, not just as wife, but entirely, and also your purpose to a certain extent. But, of course, there was also the problem of Queen Victoria, who was widowed in 1861 and who mourned her husband right until she died in 1901. And this is a sketch which is called Slandered by Traitors, because Queen Victoria was actually criticised for being in mourning for way too long and for neglecting her other duties because she was in mourning, because she was so focused on mourning Albert. So there are two sides to the coin, really, this kind of political critique, but also the expectation that you would function as a reminder of your dead husband. And there are also other takes on this, and again I'm bringing you back to Dickens here. This is from Bleak House, 1852 to 1853, it was first serialised. And in case you don't know her, this is Mrs. Badger. Now, I know it doesn't look like a very exciting picture, but it gets much better if I tell you that this is Mrs. Badger's third, fourth husband. I will have to read up on that. And these are her previous husbands. And Dickens' kind of comic take on this situation is that Mrs. Badger lives in a house which is filled with pictures of her previous husbands. And even her current husband is very proud of this. He says, oh yeah, look at this. This is Mrs. Badger's previous husband, who was a very distinguished naval officer. And Dickens makes light of a situation here which for the Victorians would have been really quite uncomfortable. And I'll show you why. This is a painting by Robert Redgrave from approximately 10 years earlier, 46. And what you can see here is, it's called Throwing Off Her Weeds. So throwing off her widow's weeds, her mourning. So this is a woman who is widowed, but who is preparing, and you can see this by all the little items here that she's starting to put on, orange blossom, and of course her new dress. She's about to get married again. Now, as you can see in the picture here, the problem is that her husband, oh, you can't actually see it quite well. Well, there is a portrait, trust me, I'm not making this up. There is a portrait up here of her former husband who is watching down on her getting ready to get married. And actually quite problematically, this isn't the original version of the painting. It actually doesn't exist anymore, because at the beginning there's a door here where a young soldier who is the new bridegroom tries to come into the room, which already in itself would have been quite not acceptable, because you don't just go into a lady's chamber, as it were. But before they exhibited this painting, Redgrave was actually forced to paint him out, because the husband watching, the former husband watching, was already enough. But then having the new husband meet him, as it were, in the painting by coming in through the door, that was considered completely impossible. So the painting, he was painted out, and that's how it was exhibited in the end. So you can see what Dickens makes light of with Mrs. Badger, because he gives it a very comical twist, is actually not so comfortable in a painting that was there 10 years earlier. And I do always wonder if Mrs. Badger was maybe based on this kind of painting. So this really brings us to Victorian mourning clothes, because as you've already seen, they're absolutely key to the widow. And I want us to come back to our beloved widow here, whose face we can't discern. On the one hand, mourning clothes were obviously meant to show that someone was in mourning, in this case a widow. And remember that it was only for widows that the mourning fashion was this extreme. Men could get away with just a little armband in the end, and women had to go through years of first full mourning, as you can see here, then half mourning, then lighter greys. It was very important what kind of fabric you wore as well, any kind of accessories, etc., etc. So on the one hand, it marks you out as a person in mourning, a person that maybe wants to be shielded from the world, a person that should be respected because they're in grief. But there were also very clearly and very openly some other concerns. And this is Mrs. John Sherwood, who's actually an American. And this is from a book on social customs and etiquette in 1886. Now, she instantly points out that there is something much more dubious about mourning clothes occasionally. She says a heartless wife who, instead of being grieved at the death of her husband, is rejoiced at it, should be taught that society will not respect her unless she pays to the memory of the man whose name she bears that homage which vice pays to virtue. Mourning garments, and this is the important part, mourning garments are a shield to the real mourner, and they are often a curtain of respectability to the person who should be a mourner, but is not. So there is a whole new aspect to mourning clothes, the idea that actually they do not shield a mourner, but they actually mask someone who isn't in mourning at all, despite the fact that they should be. And this is a really interesting aspect that comes through in what's called mid-Victorian sensation fiction, which was particularly popular in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, as the title already tells you, sensation fiction is all about sensation. There's lots of murder, lots of death, normally lots of adultery, illegitimate children, the whole range. And what's interesting about sensation fiction is that a lot of the time the woman who is somehow breaking the norm masquerades as a widow. And what I find interesting about that is that on the one hand she masquerades as a widow in order to pretend she's respectable, because after all a widow was once married and thus respectable, whilst the spinster had never had that respect from that sense. But on the other hand, employing that very device of her masquerading as a widow shows that there is something subtly uncomfortable about the widow, particularly in the mid-19th century. There seems to be something unsettling, and that potential that someone might be masquerading rather than actually being genuinely grieving always seems to be there, especially in mid-19th century culture. And the other reason why mourning clothes are interesting also for the later stages and for the later decades is that mourning clothes were one of the focus in the 1870s when it came to dress reform, when people started to campaign, and especially women started to campaign for rational dress, not just because of the expense. Imagine having to put a whole household into mourning again and again and again, including the servants, the children, but also because it was perceived as fake, especially for mourning clothes, especially for funerals. People were saying, well, if you're really grieving, then you can grieve inwards. There is no need to show this to the outside world to that extreme. So again, we get that notion of deceit somehow, which is implicit there. So these are really the three main aspects which make the widow, I think, a very distinctive figure, certainly in the Victorian period, but also what I hope these points that I've made there linked to is also that the widow is very important when we come into the 20th century. When it comes to the establishment of the welfare state, for example, she becomes important again. And what's also very interesting is that, for example, in the 1960s, the BBC Radio aired a program called The World of the Widow, and the interviews that they aired sounded so very similar to what widows in the Victorian period were experiencing. There were women in the 1960s talking about not being invited to certain parties because people either felt uncomfortable about having someone there who's grieving, who's experienced loss, but also being uncomfortable about having an available and sexually experienced woman there. So this is a very brief start to what, as you can probably tell by now, will be a rather big project. So thanks for listening. I hope I haven't shortened your lifespan. Thank you.
I think you partially answered my question in terms of when did the requirement to not wear widow's weeds disappear, and what were the drivers? Were they the dress, fashion requirements or cultural requirements? You said that it was around not wanting this deception part. But when did that actually end?
Well, the real kind of what was called the culture of grief, that kind of almost fetishization of grief, the real ending to mourning culture was really only in the 1970s, very, very contemporary. You know, that's really now when we don't tend to look at people funny if they don't wear black when they've lost someone. You know, it's very much an individual choice. Having said that, Dickens very early on was always someone who said he does not want people to wear mourning at his funeral. And he was obviously a very colourful character. He hated the idea of it. But of course it wasn't really up to him in the end what was socially acceptable. Yeah. And of course it's nothing that's ever written into law, is it? It's a very kind of...
transition.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you think, for your own personal opinion, do you think that people's attitudes to widows have changed?
I think so, yes, but what I think is really interesting at the moment, especially kind of from the turn of the millennium, because of course there's been quite a bit of focus on war widows, and widows really started organising themselves into associations, war widows organisations, general widows associations on a national level often, in about the 60s and 70s, and it strikes me that at the turn of the millennium there have been a lot of radio programmes in particular which talk to the last surviving widows of, for example, the First and Second World War. So it seems that also the widow has taken on almost some kind of function of public memory for us when it comes to the war widow in particular. And what I'm hoping to do really is actually get in touch with a lot of those widows associations and actually get to talk to some of the widows and maybe have them engage with what widowhood was like 100 years ago. Obviously it's going to be a very ethically challenging as well as emotionally challenging project, obviously, but I think that would be really interesting to see what their experiences are, especially in terms of welfare, social acceptance. There's been a big piece actually in the newspaper not 2 weeks ago where a war widow whose partner died in Afghanistan, she is now together with one of his friends. And she was absolutely slated in the typical kind of Sunday newspapers. So maybe we haven't come that far after all. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much.
It would be interesting if you do contact the widows groups and you propose that actually the masquerade element and the deceiving people by wearing but they'll tell you to leave very quickly.
Yes, I think that a part of the challenge of the project is obviously that what I've talked to you about here very much is a case of doing, is an exercise in cultural and literary studies. You know, it's not an ethnographic study of, reading letters by widows of the 19th century, for example, or a contemporary ethnographic study. It's much more about, or what I'd like to look at is about what's associated with the widow, what kinds of representations do we find in literature and also in other cultural texts, like in the suffragette pamphlets, for example, political propaganda. The widow was really big in political propaganda between the wars, for example, again, quite obviously, So it's much more about how can we look at those representations and see maybe what anxieties we've projected onto that figure, how can she actually tell us something about the problems and anxieties and ideologies that we're trying to kind of put on those representations, if that makes sense. But I'd love to combine that with, doing something in terms of engagement, really, and then, bring that material, which very few people have looked at, very few people have looked at the widow, bring that material to other people to whom it might be relevant,
Just the idea of deceit, which you followed up as well, is the one that really interested me, this idea of people possibly being seen as women being seen as masquerading as widows. Is that just to do with the fact that a kind of, I think you've hinted at it, really, societal unease with a woman who's potentially got respect but hasn't got a man by her side, sort of thing? Is it something to do with that? I mean, were they seriously suggesting that women might be pretending to be widows who actually weren't?
No, I think that there's two aspects to that, really. In fiction, you do find the widow who is actually not a widow, who masquerades as a widow because there is a certain respect attached to it. But obviously, we were looking at that thinking, well, we can see the respect attached to it, but by the very fact that the widow pops up in so much of that kind of fiction, it tells us that there clearly was also a little bit more subversion perhaps about that figure. And then in cases like, for example, the quotation that I showed you from the guidebook on social etiquette, there seemed to be I mean, this is really a guidebook that women would have read at the time. And there seems to be the real insinuation that some women may not be as happy as happy as they should be, as much in mourning inwardly as they maybe should be.
So that's about deceit, about the level of their grief.
Exactly, exactly.
About the fact that they may
I haven't come across anyone really pretending to be a woman, to be a widow.
That pops up in fiction a fair bit, which is interesting.
Yes, definitely. I think in the fiction it's very interesting. You get a lot of scheming widows. You get those two opposites if you want. You get, like I said in the very beginning, you get the poor widow, who is almost, you know, virginal. She's so innocent and, you know, so reliant on charity, and she's this really good character. And then you get a lot of scheming widows who are scheming to get, you know, good marriages for their daughters, good marriages for themselves, and they're really represented as very calculated women, you know.
I don't suppose you had any idea about the readership of those sorts of books and the different audiences that you read them, I guess.
You mean the fiction?
Yeah.
I mean the fiction, sensation fiction, we're talking, this was the popular fiction of the time. That was serialised in the big newspapers, you know, especially in the 1860s and 1870s. We're talking the authors that you may have come across, you know, from Mary Elizabeth Braddon to, you know, East Lynne, all the things that you've seen pretty much serialised by the BBC. So they were really popular at the time. They were the bestsellers that people would read weekly in instalments and would wait for. So yeah, they were definitely popular.
Have you identified any differences where a woman was independent, for example, if she was married to a merchant sailor who was away for many months, compared to whether they would mourn differently, etc.?
Yeah, you mean where she would still have to manage the estate, as it were, or whatever they had. I haven't actually looked into that in detail yet, but it's really interesting because, like you say, in theory, that there is a theoretical guardian, male guardian there, but not physically present, is he? So that will be a really interesting comparison to make, actually, and see if there are representations of these kinds of women, and do they differ? Is there a more negative take when there really is no male guardian anymore because he's deceased?
That would be worth talking to Nick White in the HSS.
All right, okay.
Because he's with his maritime experience.
Okay, that makes sense, yes.
Do you think,
thank you.
Is there any difference in the portrayal of the widow outside of sort of UK literature in terms of?
I've only looked at the UK context at the moment. The American context is fairly similar. What is interesting, particularly in the 19th century, is of course the UK's obsession with sati in India, the practice of the widow being burnt on the grave of her husband. And at the time in Britain, as so often I suppose during the Empire, the British were very keen on writing about this and how wrong it was, but then a lot of people now have made the case that actually when you're veiled like Mrs. Howson, you are socially also dead, and there were so many kind of norms and things placed on the widow in the UK, yet people felt very able to condemn what was being done, you know, in the far reaches of the Empire. So there are really interesting international engagements from Britain with other cultures of mourning, but I haven't actually looked at kind of more international context.
Dead, the long step away from dead.
Yeah, it is, yeah. It is, but it comes with that air of superiority that was very common.
Are there any other questions? It was fascinating.
Thank you.